Hello, I'm Arlie Schlanger with our weekly update with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and president of the Schiller Institute. It's January 21st, 2021. Well, we're 3 weeks into the new year, and already it's been a year of surprises, of tumult, of chaos. We had yesterday the inauguration of Joe Biden, and I find it a bit ironic that Biden's main theme was unity, when I guess he intends to enforce unity through censorship, through a new Patriot Act. What did you make of his speech, Helga?
Well, I watched the inauguration and his speech naturally. I mean, first of all, um, I'm not impressed by his uh, artistic taste. I thought that Lady Gaga was quite horrible. If you compare the beautiful song of Marian Anderson, the national anthem of, I think it was John F. Kennedy, um, inauguration, and Lady Gaga, then you get a sense of what is wrong with the culture. Now, let's say we would give Biden the credit that he means what he said, that he wants to have unity. And well, then I have a very good advice for him. He's a Catholic. Um, and then he should read the encyclical of Pope Paul VI, which he wrote in 1967, which was called Populorum Progressio, about the progress of all people, and in which he said that the new name for peace is development. And in the same way, one can say that the new name for unity is development. The only way one can hope to have, uh, unity inside the United States would be to put on the agenda an economic program which would give productive jobs to every American, which would undo the economic injustices, which are, after all, the reason why Trump was elected in 2016 and why all the Trump voters are still sticking to Trump. So if he wants to have unity, he should make development the new name for unity. And internationally, it would go in the same direction. Now, I don't know. If he means it serious, he has to get rid of identity politics. Because, as long as you divide people by their ethnic or sexual or other, conviction or distinction, this is polarizing. This is exactly the opposite of what Martin Luther King said, that everything has to be inclusive. Now, let's see what Biden does. The reality will show itself very quickly by its deeds and not by the words. Now, a lot could be said more, but he's a new president, so let's see what will happen. Now, uh, if you look at the team he has selected, well, many of those are from the old Obama administration. Many have come out already agreeing with Pompeo, for example, on the anti-China, anti-Russia stance. Tony Blinken said he agrees with Pompeo on China. So that does not forebode very good. And one cannot forget that the shadow which is hanging over the Biden administration is exactly what was done in the 5 years of the Trump candidacy in 2016, the 4 years of Trump's presidency, where we had Russiagate, we had the Mueller report, we had impeachment 1, impeachment 2. We had the collusion of the heads of intelligence with British intelligence against Trump for this entire period. So, if that is the heritage, and now basically, if everybody who voted for Trump is potentially a domestic terrorist, well, if somebody is white male and voted for Trump, if is labeled domestic terrorists, that makes about minimum something like 40 million Americans domestic terrorists. I don't think that will work for unity. So, I think that a lot of things have to be changed. And as I said, the only way how Biden could possibly unify the United States would be to completely break with the policy he has campaigned on in the election campaign, the Green New Deal, because the Green New Deal means that the task to have a productive job for every American is absolutely impossible. So if he doesn't change policy, which is not likely, obviously, I don't think any of the words what he said will mean much. So let's see. I think my advice to Biden would be go with the encyclica Populorum Progressio. The new name for unity is development.
Well, two interesting aspects on the departure of President Trump. One is that finally we got the declassification of some of the documentation around the Russiagate, with the release of the FBI interview of Christopher Steele, in which Steele admitted that he went public. He produced the dossier because he was worried about the British relationship with the United States, and hopefully there'll be more coming. It's a little late, but I was quite disappointed in Trump's decision to issue a pardon to sleazy Steve Bannon and not to do something with Julian Assange. Do you have some thoughts on that, Helga?
Yeah, disappointing is a mild word. I think not to pardon Assange is really not defensible, because it's no question that Assange is sitting in jail in Great Britain for having uncovered some real crimes. And he's a whistleblower, which should be protected in any society which respects the the laws it has given itself. So it's a threat to Assange's life, and now it will be much more difficult, to save him. So I think this is really absolutely indefensible. Concerning Bannon, this unfortunately is not a surprise, because it was clear for the better part of 2020 that Trump, who had distanced himself from Bannon, which was a good thing, had moved back in the influence domain of Bannon, starting in April, when he started to say this line that the virus, the coronavirus was deliberately spread by China, which is scientifically ridiculous. Nobody in the world who has any knowledge about pandemics would would argue like that. And it was also wrong. I mean, it's a matter of fact that China has done an enormous job to contain the virus, and to then immediately help a lot of other countries, first with masks, then with medical supplies, now with the vaccine. So it is wrong, and to say something like that is also dangerous, because it is creating an enemy image, which, in line with what the military-industrial complex is saying and doing against China, is creating an enemy image for a potential future military conflict, which is really non-excusable. So I think this is really bad, and Trump also stuck to his line that the U.S. economy is doing great because the stock markets are going up or are up. I mean, all of these are the weak points, and I don't think that was a very good departure at all.
Now, you mentioned the strategic continuity between people like Blinken, the new Secretary of State, or would-be Secretary of State, with Pompeo. We saw something that was quite hideous with Hillary Clinton and Pelosi conspiring to criminalize all 75 million Trump voters, but also continuing the targeting of Russia. If this continues, this is extremely dangerous.
Well, I mean, sometimes one wonders, if if either Hillary and Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi are the Democratic version of QAnon, or maybe the two ladies have a severe attack of paranoia, because the idea that what Hillary actually said, that she thinks that it's possible that Trump was on the telephone with Putin during the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. I mean, it's a world full of conspiracies, of insinuations, of, you know, it's just completely, I think, deranged.
I like that, the twin Q sisters. Uh, Now, the other thing that's happening is we're seeing a kickoff in a couple of days of the Green New Deal with the World Economic, the WEF, the Davos group, pushing their green policy based on the Great Reset. There's resistance developing to that. This really is no solution, but what do you think is going to come of this meeting the next couple of days?
Well, it will be interesting because it's a virtual meeting. It will be addressed by many heads of state. Not all of them are on this Green Deal line. You know, you have President Fernandez from Argentina, President Xi from China, Modi from India, Prime Minister Modi from India, Merkel, Macron. So I think we will hear quite different accentuations from these different leaders. But it is very clear that the Davos crowd, you know, this is the top 3,000 CEOs of the top financial institutions and multinational corporations, they are pushing for the Green New Deal, the Great Reset, the idea of implementing a stakeholder capitalism, as they say. You know, there will be a tremendous push to brainwash the whole world into accepting the idea that, you know, everything has to be green, all investment must only go in green technology. But, you know, the reality is that there are now the first voices, you know, realizing that, you know, so speaking out, that this will be a catastrophe. For example, of a place where you would not necessarily expect it from, namely an economist from Deutsche Bank, Eric Hyman. He put out a quite interesting article saying that the policy of the EU, which is naturally also for the Green Deal, is very dishonest, because they are not telling people that this will only go through with a massive uh, reduction in the living standard. And that, in turn, can only be implemented through massive eco dictatorship. With other words, with a complete, you know, abandoning of all legality and constitutionality by implementing dictatorial measures. Now, that is slowly dawning on some people. For example, when the EU just recently tried to implement the famous or infamous taxonomy, as they're naming it, which means that all the firms have to give their CO2 footprint. 10 countries refused to do that. And the EU was forced to postpone this whole affair because they couldn't get the unity. It was mostly East European and South European countries who obviously, you know, have been already on the losing end in terms of the EU austerity policy. So their enthusiasm for the EU policy is very limited, to say the least, in the first place. So I think that this whole Green Deal is absolutely crazy. For example, the head of Toyota in Japan, his name is Mr. Toyoda. He calculated and said that if you want to put Japan entirely on e-cars, electric cars, it would cost investments in infrastructure of over 1 trillion. Now, we took the figures given by the Toyota study and tried to calculate a similar cost for the EU. Germany alone is already scheduled to lose 400,000 jobs in the auto sector if there is a transition to e-cars. But that is because they have much less components for the motors, so the supply industry gets shrunk. But it's much worse. First of all, you would need an investment in infrastructure for e-cars in Europe of over 1 trillion euro, probably 1.2 trillion euro. And naturally, then you have no electricity, because we already had several almost blackouts for the entire European energy grid last week. Now, if you try to put all these cars on electric fuel, the electricity is by far not sufficient. So this whole thing is economically very stupid. It would destroy the industrial countries of Europe, the United States, and Asia if they would go with it. So I can imagine that there will be a lot more resistance once people start to realize what the effect is. It will drive energy prices even higher. It will cause mass unemployment. It will drive prices in general much higher. So I think that if there is an effort to implement that in earnest, what we have seen in terms of Brexit vote, Trump vote, riots in the streets, yellow vests, all of that will absolutely increase, because you cannot destroy the livelihood of millions and millions of people without that they start to go to the street and protest when they realize their livelihood is in danger. So I can only say, people should abandon this idea. There is climate change, obviously, but what it is exactly is not so clear. There are big debates in the scientific community. There are many studies, which attribute the climate change to very different phenomena like galactic cycles. We have introduced on the Schiller Institute website a subpage which is called, I think, Green Science. And there we will institute an international debate where we already have many scientific papers by many scientists. And, I invite you to go to the site. We will have many more coming in the next days and weeks. So that is a place where you can inform yourself about what is really behind this Green Deal and, get a more scientific approach.
And while we're talking about this question of the loss of energy production that's planned with the Green New Deal, we have an attack from Pompeo in the United States against the Nord Stream 2, which is crucial for Germany. But we're also seeing something interesting. The choice for the new chairman of the Christian Democrats in Germany is someone who's considered to be anti-green. How significant is this?
Well, first of all, it is not so clear that the German industry and politicians will capitulate to the U.S. sanctions. I mean, obviously, that the danger of being hit with such sanctions is a deterrent. So one of the industries involved, Bilfinger, already withdrew. Even Gazprom said it's questionable if it can be brought into completion. But there is also massive resistance, because people know that what's behind that is an effort on the one side to treat Germany and the other 12 European countries who participate in Nord Stream 2 as a colony, and people don't like that so much anymore. And secondly, everybody knows the US wants to sell their liquid natural gas. And that is also pretty obvious. It's more expensive. It's more environmentally unfriendly, to say the least. So I think there is still resistance. Concerning Mr. Laschet, he is now already attacked that he was soft on Putin, that he did not agree with the Skripal interpretation, that he didn't make enough fuss about the Navalny case. I think all that speaks for Laschet, because all of these cases were absolute efforts to manipulate an anti-Russian hysteria. So that's all I can say on that point for now.
Now, going to the more crazy side of US politics, we have this movement called QAnon, which was predicting a military coup, that Biden would be arrested, Hillary arrested, Trump would be brought back in. Uh, this has many people wrapped up in it, and it's turning out now from the research we're starting to do that this was a military psyop from the beginning, using the military side of artificial intelligence and so on. This is also emerging in Europe as well. I mean, what do you make of this, Helga?
Well, I think it is a psychological warfare operation against the population to try to confuse them. Uh, as you say, we are looking into the connections to the military right now. But there is also another interesting observation which intrigued me. It's written by a designer of games, Mr. Berkowitz, and he basically says that looking at the way the QAnon operation works, he said it's exactly like the games he is designing, that it leads to something which he calls apophenia, which is a notion coming from psychology, which means that people have a sort of free association where they connect things and put them together in a pattern, so that it looks logical, but these things are not connected, or at least not in the way how they are being put together. For example, you have this really crazy interpretation of people who say that the entire COVID-19 is just a conspiracy to implement military or dictatorial means. I mean, this is a mental disorder, because the pandemic is quite real, which we should talk about a little bit later. But I think this idea of of game theory and or designing games is actually quite accurate. And when I read the article by Berkowitz, I was immediately reminded of my research into the Romantic movement. Now, this is extremely important because, well, how do people judge things like reality? How do they know that their judgment is truthful, or at least trying to be truthful? Well, you have to think like a scientist, or you have to think like a classical artist, because these are the only two groups of people who think in terms of universal principles. A universal principle is something which you can verify everywhere, no matter if you are in Africa or in the United States or in Europe, because it's a universal principle, because it's universal. Therefore, you have a test of reality. Now, the last time there was a culture which was based on such universal principles was the German classical period, which produced such giants like, Bach and Beethoven, Haydn, Schubert, Schumann, but in poetry, Schiller, Shakespeare would be another from another period, a proponent of such a universal thinking. And this was extremely important because it established a high standard of morality, a high standard of intelligence, of creativity. And it would have liberated the population to be truly free if that would have been the dominant culture. And it was on a good way in Germany, because one of the closest friends and collaborators of Schiller, for example, Wilhelm von Humboldt, had designed the Humboldt education system, and when he was education minister, he started to implement it. And it would have, really meant that the entire population would have been rational, creative. The potential of everybody would have been poured out. So it was on a very good way. But then, a counter movement developed, which started maybe innocently as a romantic, just a slightly confused form of thinking in the person of Novalis. But then soon there were some others like August Wilhelm and Friedrich Schlegel, Tieck, And these people were quickly taken over by Metternich, by the Restoration, and they became the political romantics. Now, what is the difference between classical thinking and romantic thinking? The classical thinking is what I said before. You have an absolute ability to find the truth by the method of exhaustion, by establishing principles which can be found and established and proven again and again, because they are there are principles which are pertaining to the real universe. What the Romantics started to do, they started to consciously take the poetical, stringent form of the classical culture apart by saying there should be no beginning, there should be no end, day and night and day and dream should all be interwoven. We should have free association, follow, diffuse emotions. And, this became a real Schwärmerei, and it turned the absolute optimism of the German classical period into the pessimism, which then in the end, and I'm leaving out now many steps in between, it ended in the horrible 12 years of the National Socialism in Germany, which was sort of the end form, or in the modern deconstruction of all modern art. So, when you see something like that and you see a method being applied which consciously confuses people, like it is clearly the case in the QAnon movement or whatever, it is a psychological warfare of people, because it goes against science. It makes people deliberately, believing into things which they are not able anymore to think through. And I think it's a real dangerous thing, and we will do some more work on it to discover what it really is.
Good. That was very important what you just went through. We're down to just a couple minutes, so I'm going to jump ahead to the one question that you referred to earlier, which is the importance of addressing the new variants of coronavirus. This is now out of control in Germany and the United Kingdom. The situation seems to be getting worse. The vaccines are not ready. Where's this headed?
Well, just today there was a meeting, an EU meeting, and Merkel, who, is not my favorite politician, but she said something which is extremely truthful, unfortunately, and she seems to have a little bit better grasp on the COVID than most politicians have shown. And she is warning of something which many medical experts have expressed extreme concern about in the recent days, namely that these new variants, which emerged in Great Britain, in South Africa, and in Brazil, each of them being different, are rapid variations, and that there is a danger that soon these variants will be vaccine resistant. Now, if that would happen, then we would look into a completely different kind of catastrophe, because up to now, for example, in the United States, most of the bets, at least in the previous administration, were put on developing quickly a vaccine, and if that goes out of the window, then you are really in trouble. So I think that the only possible answer to that is we have to have a world health system. This is what we have been saying since the beginning of this pandemic, that unless you have a modern health system in every single country, in Haiti, in Mali, in Ecuador, in India, just simply every single country, you are not going to protect your country. The idea that America or Germany or any one of these so-called advanced countries can be protected when the pandemic is raving in the developing countries is simply an illusion. And since the medical experts already have been warning that new viruses are already basically waiting to spread, new variants of MERS and SARS, that, this question of really changing the attitude towards the developing sector is becoming a question of the moral fitness to survive of the entire human species. That means we have to build modern health systems in every country, and that is only possible if you have infrastructure. If you don't have clean water, electricity, means of transport and communication, you can't do it. So we are at the crossroad where we in earnest have to go to the policy of Franklin D. Roosevelt, what he intended with the Bretton Woods system, which was never realized because he died too early. But he wanted to increase the living standard of the entire population of the world. And that, he said, is the precondition for peace. I think we are at that point where we either correct that failure of the entire post-war period, or we will go into an endless series of catastrophes. So that is the program which we have been putting forward. 1.5 billion productive jobs have to be created newly, and the whole drive has to start with this idea of a world health system. And I would appeal to all of you who are listening to this, that if you agree with that, then you should join our efforts. We have created a committee for the coincidence of opposites, which is trying to get an approach to all the aspects of this problem, meaning to double food production worldwide, to deal with the famine of biblical dimensions, and also at the same time train young people to be helpers of medical personnel, partnerships with the developing countries. All of this is still in the works. But I think we have to really start with a change in the attitude. You cannot solve this pandemic in one country, and you cannot for sure solve it with the Green Deal. If you go for the Green Deal, there is no way how the necessary science and technology will be available, or the industrial capacities to implement such a world health system. So we are at a crossroad, and you should join the Schiller Institute and work with us to give this whole thing a different direction.
Well, for updates on this story of the coronavirus, as well as everything else we were discussing today, you can get them at the LaRouche Organization website, as well as the Schiller Institute. So Helga, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next week.
Till next week.